So these are 5 things, 5 principles that I think are quite simple, but they're really essential to how Rembrandt is able to achieve the sort of liveliness that he gets. He gets this really incredible glowing quality. I'm sure you're familiar with it. And the way that he's able to do it is basically because of these principles. So these are things you'll be able to apply right away. You should be able to start using them, just after today, and you'll start to see more liveliness in your own paintings. So the first thing here is to simplify your palette. I think there's a somewhat misconception about Rembrandt's palette, that he's using a lot of colors, or that he has this sort of blending of colors, or he's using very saturated colors, things like that. These are a lot of typical beginner mistakes where they will use pure yellow or pure red, or they'll include other colors that are just outside of this whole spectrum that Rembrandt has, things like blue or green and other bright colors that are disturbing. So this is one of his later paintings. This is Simon in the Temple, and this is maybe more in the opposite direction what some people might expect, which is that it's kind of just appears like it's all warm. But there's actually quite a bit going on here. This is a breakdown of those basic colors that we can find. He has this sort of highlight white color. So that's basically just your pure white, or white with a little bit of color in it, maybe a little bit of orange or yellow. And then these colors right here are what I'm very, very interested in. So these are more of those fleshy colors, and he's able to get this, as I'll show you here in a moment, he's able to get this by basically just blending white with a little bit of orange. And that's really key. He doesn't try to make it complicated. He doesn't try to really go overboard and try to get every single little color in here. He doesn't try to use the yellow and the red extremely specifically. He keeps it simple, and because he does that, you get a really compelling effect where you feel like it's real flesh. So this is what I would break down if I needed to just have 4 or 5 colors on my palette. This is how I would break down Rembrandt's palette. I'd have this light color, I'd have these 2 colors here. So one is a little bit lighter. This is more like white with the orange. This one is the orange, maybe with a little tint of black. And then this is your deep dark brown or black. So you only really find this in a few areas, which I'm going to talk about later. But this color right here is very rare. And then you have this kind of what I would call a Pellis blue. It's not really a true blue. It's not like you're using ultramarine blue or something like that. This is more like a Mars black together with white. That's how you'd get this type of color. And he would use that very sparingly as well. The other place where it would be very useful is more like areas like this in the beard, or up here in the hair, anywhere that you're going to have more of a gray. What you could do is you could take this blue and then you could combine that with the other colors. These colors right here are what I would recommend you use. This is how I think you should simplify your palette. So here's another example. This is a little bit earlier. This one's in the Frick collection in New York. It's not necessarily the best self-portrait. I think his last self-portrait is a better one, the one that's in London. But this is still a really, really good self-portrait and a really good one to study, because this one is a little bit more simple in some of the things going on here, like some of the brushwork, some of the colors, is actually a little bit easier to identify compared to that last self-portrait that's in London. But again, you see the same thing. So this is the kind of principle I'm going to be pushing here, is everything comes from this sort of orange base. So we find this orange in these really warm areas, like right here in the cheek, maybe a little bit here, in the lips, in the nose, and it's sparingly used in such a high contrast form. What he's doing is he's taking this same base color here, and then he's using that to create his other flesh colors. So he takes this, if you add black to it, you're going to get this brown, that you find up here in the shadows. If you add white to the orange, you're going to get more of this type of flesh tone, which is a little bit more vibrant. It feels like it's got some punch to it. But this is the other part that many people might not expect. So if I go back, this blue right here, this sort of Apelles blue, as I mentioned, what he's doing is he's adding this to his other flesh colors to mute them. So you rarely find such a bright blue or such a cold blue in Rembrandt's palette. You often find more colors like this sort of muted gray, something that's going to help to create the volume and contrast. So when we put this side by side with these warmer colors, it's going to help to give punch to this orange. So this part feels really vibrant because we have these cooler accents. So this is what my palette looks like, how I structure my palette. As I mentioned, you have this orange. So this orange is something that you're going to find through everything. It's going to go through the entire palette. That's basically the whole base. So this is just a mixture of yellow and red. And this is a literal color from my palette. So this is the actual orange that I keep on my palette, that I'm going to blend it with the white. So going in this direction, this is the light side of my palette. You can see I have the orange here. I add white to it, and that's how I get this color right here. So if we go back to Rembrandt, that would be like this color, something that you're going to find here in this very warm area. Then I'm going to add even more white to that. So the brightest highlights are just going to be the orange with more white, and that's going to give you something, excuse me, not the brightest highlights, but basically your second brightest highlights, things that are going to create a lot of this volume, but it's not your pure white. So that's going to be things like right here, along the nose, this part right here, and having basically that transition between these two colors is going to help to really give that vibrancy. Then going in the other direction, I'm going to pull this orange over here to the shadow side of my palette, and if you add black, that's how you're going to get your browns. So that's what we're getting up here in this shadow area. You can see it in the forehead. I've got some more examples coming later. So you'll see all this area, all around here, all these shadows. Many people, kind of make the mistake of assuming just because it's in the shadows, it's black. It has a lot of darkness. But what you're going to find out is actually there's a lot of warmth in here. We have a lot of color. So that's what I'm doing when I'm mixing my palette. As you see here, I'm adding that black, and I have a lot of orange in there. So that's going to give it this nice warm tint, or this nice warm sort of glow. And that's very essential. And then we're also going to do the same thing for these midtones. So as I mentioned, here we have this blue. This is one of the few examples where I really find the Apelles blue in Rembrandt's paintings. But it is here. We have that color over here. This is where I have it on my palette. I pretty much never use this color. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to take this blue, I'm going to combine it with some of the orange. That's going to give me gray. The gray is much more useful. So again, that's more like what you'd find in this area, or in the later painting you'd find it in all this beard area and some of these transitions. So by just reducing the amount of warmth here, we're going to help to actually create contrast, and it's going to make other parts feel more warm. So this is how I recommend that you mix your palette. If you use simplified colors like this, you're really going to get a lot more bang for your buck, so to speak. You're going to be able to do things much easier. You're going to be able to create this sort of contrast. You're going to be able to create this vibrancy without needing to use as much effort. I mean, just having a more complex palette just makes things more complex, right? So what I recommend is that you use this orange as your base, add some white, add some black. Now you've got your light side and you've got your shadow side. If you need something in between, you could even just mix these colors. You don't necessarily even need that blue, because what's going to happen if you take a brown like this or like this and you mix that with one of your flesh colors, guess what? We've already got the black and we've got the white mixed in there, so it's going to end up being in that gray range anyways. So this is getting into that next part. As I mentioned, with those shadows, the shadows have a lot of warmth. There's a lot of color there, and a lot of people don't really realize that. If we look here, this is, I think, just the perfect example. You've got these variations where you have all these warm browns. So this is the misconception, I think, that really hurts a lot of people, is They think just because it's shadows, it must be black. But actually we have a lot of these warm browns. So that's going to be absolutely essential. So that's why if you take your palette and you mix it really simply like this, guess what? You're not doing as much work, but you're going to get way further compared to anyone who's using just that black or who doesn't know how to mix these shadow colors properly. You're better off ending up a little bit too warm, having too much of this orange, making your shadows a little bit too orange. It's actually going to look much more compelling than if you make it too black. So this color here, right here, this is kind of the transition. So you go from this lighter area in the shadow side to these warmer shadows. So this would represent, something where you have a little bit of blending of these lighter tones coming in right here. So that's why you get that one that feels maybe just a little bit cooler, a little bit lighter. And otherwise, these areas that stand out, it's either going to be that sort of warmer brown that I showed, this one right here, or in these darker areas, you're just adding a little bit more black. That's all you have to do. But this is a nice sort of brown, and you get this by just mixing orange and black. That's all you have to do. So again, in the midtones on this side, look at all this color. Everything on this side is in the midtone range. There's a lot of people who will kind of make the mistake maybe looking at Caravaggio. Caravaggio has that same sort of punch in a way, chiaroscuro effect, but it's not all white. Even in Caravaggio, you find this type of transition. So you have a lot of these warm colors and a lot of these cool colors that are complementing them, and that's what really helps to give that volume. There's not very many highlights. There's not very many bright whites in here. I'm going to talk more about that later, but the main point here, whether you're on the light side or you're on the shadow side, you're going to have all these warm colors and all these other sort of complementary midtones coming in. So you're better off to end up in that midtone range rather than either going very, very white on the light side or going very, very black on the dark side. Either way, what you're going to do is you're going to flatten out the face, and it's just not going to look as compelling. So here is the next sort of principle: sanding your painting. This is a really, really easy way to get some of this nice glowing quality. You're going to be able to create an atmospheric effect. You're going to have a nice softness around your painting. So if you break up the edges, if you sand your painting, that's when you get things more like this. This right here, I think, is the best self-portrait of Rembrandt. This is his last self-portrait. So these are still, the same colors, same principles being applied, but it's got more transparency. He's built it up in more layers. He's scraped it back down, and he's just continued to work on it. He's taken that previous self-portrait that we were looking at, this one, and he's elevated it. He's taken it to the next level. He's gotten all these nice soft transitions so that when you see something like this in person, it's still going to have that punch. You're still going to feel like there is a face in front of you. There's a person in front of you. But on top of that, it's in the space. It's like you're looking into a room and there's a person in front of you. You have a real atmosphere and a real sense of depth. So that's a very easy way that you can elevate your paintings. If you start to sand and scrape down your paintings, it's going to give you these nice soft effects without much effort. You don't need to have a ton of experience sanding your painting for it to become useful. It becomes useful right away. It's quite easy in many ways. It's quite easy to add that to your repertoire and to start using it. Sanding and simple and bold brushwork in layers. These go hand in hand. So both of these are quite essential. So this is an earlier Rembrandt. It's still, quite fun to look at. We find a lot of the same colors here. This is still the same palette. Nothing is different in that regard. But I find this a fun example because you can see all of the brush strokes. For a lot of beginners, that's something that's very, very appealing. That becomes, a little bit enchanting in a way because you can understand what's going on. So sometimes I do think it's a good idea as a beginner to study paintings like this because it is so simple. You get to see what's going on and look at how he's doing this. But when you combine this with layering and with sanding, that's when you really start to elevate. So this is a little bit later down the road. This is the one that's in the Frick collection in New York. And you start to see there's a little bit more depth here. We still see brush marks. You can still see the sort of trail, and there's some nice bold brush marks. But we also get some of this transparency. We get some more softness, like here in the hair. We get these nice mid-tone grays and transitions, and he's achieving these sort of colors and this sense of depth, sense that there's actually flesh here. He's achieving that by sanding. And then you get this in the end. So this is an example where you have even more layers, you have even more transparency, and now we start to get this sense of mystery. It's not so easy to pick out what is exactly going on here. You can't say, you know, every single brush stroke is placed with intention in the same way as that first portrait that we looked at, this one here. You know, it looks like every single brush mark is just what needs to be there, but at the same time, that kind of removes the mystery, and it starts to make it look more like a painting rather than a person. So sanding is the really easy way to add that depth and building up the layers. If you go and you combine both of these, painting with a broad, direct brush mark, and then you build it up in layers, that's when you really achieve the ultimate level. So the thing that I recommend, what I think you should do, whether you're starting out or you're very experienced, doesn't matter, you should use a very broad brush, something at least as broad as what we find here, and then you should sand or scrape in between layers. So either using sandpaper. Jamie, I saw your question. The grit of the sandpaper is 120 grit. That's what I find to be the best. It's not too rough or too coarse where it's going to tear into your painting, and at the same time you're going to get a nice sort of dustiness. You're going to be able to pull away the paint. So it's got a really good balance at 120 grit. I'll warn you guys, you need to be careful if you're going to use sandpaper because it can, of course, create dust, and it can create some things that are toxic if you're breathing in that dust. So be careful about what kind of colors you're using. Don't sand if you're going to use any kind of cadmium colors. Pay attention to what you're using. That's your responsibility, okay? If you're worried about that, then I recommend you use a palette knife. You can get very similar effects with a palette knife. So what you do is you just scrape over the surface using a palette knife. But if you combine these two, you combine this boldness with that sanding and scraping, and you do it over many layers, that's when you really achieve this sort of level. Another thing I'd like to point out is that when you paint very bold, when you paint with broad marks like this, it becomes very compelling. You get a nice sense of the form. You're not overly complicating things. You're not using too many details. So this by itself is much more compelling, I think, than using very many details. But if you combine these, you sort of get the details through the process of sanding. As you sand and you scrape, it starts to create these sort of overlays or overlaps as if you're stitching the painting together. It's going to bring together the different parts and essentially create those details. So most of the time when I'm painting, I'm using a very broad brush. I'm using even more broad than what can be found here. And as I build up those layers, as I start to sand and scrape down between each layer, then I'm going to basically achieve the details, but it's not going to be in the same way. The really interesting thing when you build details in this way is that there is some mystery to it. There is some obscurity. You can't quite see as the viewer what's going on, and that helps to create the sense of liveliness. This is Rembrandt's last painting, Simon in the Temple. I showed this earlier with those examples of the colors being used, and now I'm showing it again so I can just show you how broad some of these brush marks are. He's really using, you know, big brushes in some cases here. You can see just based on the way it's built up, based on some of these qualities in the beard, in the face, you have these nice big marks up here in the forehead and in the hair. And same down here with the baby. You can see he must have been using quite a broad brush. And I'm quite familiar with this painting. I've studied it a lot in person. So I can tell you, based on the scale of this painting, this is a life-size painting. So these marks are quite big. So I think that's what he was doing in those later periods, is he was using that broad brush and then he's just building up many layers, and he's sanding and scraping to create that transparency and to really stitch together the layers. Okay, this is the last point that I want to make. You need to use this combined with that simplified palette, combined with everything I've talked about already. But this is something that can really help to elevate your painting. That is focused contrast, okay? When you look at a painting like this, as I mentioned earlier, you have a lot of color around here. You have a lot of different variations in the midtones, and not to say complex. It's not like Rembrandt laid out a string of 30 different tones on his palette. He clearly kept it simple, but he really reserves this high contrast, this sharp black and sharp white. He reserves it for the focus of the painting, which is over here. It's on this light side eye, that's the focus. So he has these blacks in the facial features, in the mouth, in the nose, in the eyes. Those are the only places where we find these deep dark blacks. And then the same with the highlights is also going to lead us up here. He's really reserving the highlights. The only really bright white is going to be here on the nose, maybe a little flicker right here, and then here on the eye. So that's what's really going to bring us in. That's what's going to make this a compelling portrait. He's reserving that contrast for this area. So you can see here, this is some of the same colors that I showed before, but you see all of these are quite warm. Now if we compare, look at this brown compared to the black that we can find in the nose. That nose right in the nostril in the deepest part is a nice sharp black. And if you compare these side by side, it looks like a pretty big difference. So he's able to get some of these glowing qualities. He's able to get the definition and to convince us that there's real volume there by using these midtones and by creating that sort of volume and depth. And the only way to get that is to really be conscientious and be reserved with where you're going to use that high contrast. So the area where you should use black is the eyes, the nose, and the mouth, and that's it. Highlights should also be directed in a similar way. So he leads us up here to the focus by strategically placing these highlights. You don't find that same white in any other part of the face or in any other part of the painting, really. By directing your viewer, you're going to make it look much more compelling. So I think that's all I have here, but I'm going to demonstrate a couple of these things. I think the most useful would be to demonstrate the scraping and sanding. I imagine a lot of you wonder about that. Between each layer, I'm going to sand, and pretty much every time I'm going to wait until the painting is dry, at least touch dry. There might be some areas which are still a little bit wet. For your guys' sake, I would just recommend sand between each layer, wait for it to get dry, and this is, again, the 120 grit sandpaper. So I'll show you what I'm doing here. Let's say if your painting is a little bit wet, or if you have some thick impasto that you don't like, you can always use your palette knife too. So up here, for example, I know I have some thicker parts. I could always go over this with the palette knife just to get rid of a little bit of this, and then I could come back over it with my sandpaper. So that's an option if either your painting is a little bit too wet, or if there's some thick impasto and you're getting, these uneven edges, for example. So I'll go back over just a little bit here in the face as well, just right here. I know it's still a little bit wet because I just painted on this 1 or 2 days ago. And I was painting pretty thick. So here's what I'm looking for when I'm going to sand this. These areas that I mentioned that are these important areas, the eyes, nose, and mouth, where you're going to have that high contrast, they're also important areas for the sanding and scraping. Sand in any area that's going to be a little bit softer or that's going to be in the shadows. Those are the areas you should focus on, because that's going to create the real three-dimensional depth on the surface. So those areas you'd want to keep more thin and perhaps sand more if it's necessary. And then the other part that you're going to use sanding for is to blend together these different edges. So you're creating a sort of smoothness, a fogginess. It's going to make it more compelling. So here in the eye, I'm going to sand. See how this goes. So as I do this, it's going to obscure some of those marks that I made. So that's really helpful, because you can be sharp and you can be bold and still go back over it. I'm actually going to scrape that a little bit too. I'm going to scrape it with my palette knife because I could feel it was a little bit raised up there in the pupil. I don't want to accidentally steal any of that black and pull it into a different area. I'm just going to scrape that with my palette knife to be sure I don't mess anything up. I'm going to go back over it just a little bit. So you can see this sort of fogginess that it creates. It starts to blend together these different areas. So as we go from pupil and the iris and this white into the eyelid, it's going to start to make that a little bit foggy, which is more compelling. When we look at people, we generally don't see these things so sharply. I can just go around, I'm paying attention to what I'm doing, but usually you're not going to end up in a nightmare situation from sanding. Another one of the important benefits that you're going to get from this is that you're actually going to give yourself a better surface to work on. So as you start to sand, you're kind of perforating the surface. You're creating little holes or little dots in this top layer of paint. So that's going to give you transparency where you can see through, or you can remove that paint. It's also going to give your paint a better surface to stick to. So I'll do the same thing over here. I know this area was a little bit thick. Might want to be cautious with that actually. I'm gonna leave that. I had some problems with the nose the last time I was working on it. So for now I'm gonna leave that. Normally I'm gonna sand all this area right here because this is all shadows, but I can feel it's a little bit too thick right here, and I know that was a sensitive area last time, so I don't wanna cause any big problems, but I'll show you over here in the shadows. Let's see. Go over this eye, for example. So you can see this paint was just a little bit thick, a little bit built up. So this should dry a little bit more really before sanding it. But you're going to get these types of effects. You see how this sandpaper kind of blends together the different areas, and it creates almost a layer of atmosphere is what it really looks like, especially in person. It creates like these little lines and the blending, which just makes it feel more real. So I can go over the mouth. One of my tips is to choose a focus between the eyes and the mouth. That's something I learned from Odd Nerdrum. And the reason you want to do that is that it's going to draw our viewer in. It's going to give them something that they can settle on, something they can really focus on. If you have both the mouth and the eyes sharp, then the viewer is going to be a little bit disoriented, or they're going to have too many things to look at. So if you choose between just one of these, you're actually going to give a stronger focal point, and you're going to give the viewer something to really see and rest on. So I'll do just a little bit more sanding here, and then I'll open up the chat, and we can talk, and you guys can ask some questions. So I think that's about it. That's what I want to do right now. There's still some wet areas, as I mentioned. Alex, sanding is for losing edges, right? Yeah, that's a very, very big factor for it. That's a good reason to sand. You know, as I mentioned before, it's going to create that sense of atmosphere. It's going to make it feel like there's a real vitality, a real liveliness. Something is actually in front of you. You're seeing it. And as you build up the layers, the sort of softness and this compelling quality that you get from those soft edges is going to kind of vibrate in a way. It's going to feel as if the object is even moving, because you don't have such, you know, sharp, clear, defined edges. When I sand, it just brings out the canvas weave, even when the sandpaper is not that coarse. Maybe you could give me a little bit more information about what kind of canvas you're using, and if you have any sort of ground or what kind of preparation you're using. Linen canvas, oil ground. Okay, that's interesting. There's a couple of things I wonder about. Usually when you sand, it is going to reveal that texture underneath. So that texture from the linen can also be helpful, especially in the shadows, for example. You're going to have some transparency where your paint is going to be very transparent, and the effect that you get by revealing the linen is going to give you softness in a similar way. How I mentioned that dustiness, the linen can give you a similar sort of kind of atmospheric effect just because it's grainy. It's as if you're seeing a grainy photo. Yeah, more layers, definitely more layers. Probably try to paint a little bit more bold and direct and let it dry. If you want to really build up impasto, like over here where I have in the face where I have some more of this impasto, you just have to build up the layers and you have to allow it to dry between layers, otherwise you're just getting right back down to the surface. You can be sensitive if you want to with the sandpaper. You don't have to scrape it all the way down to the surface. I'm not saying you're doing that, but sometimes that can be a problem if you take it all the way back down. Okay, Jamie, what is the color palette for this painting? You've heard that I used the Apelles palette. Yeah, that's correct. I do use the Apelles palette. So I used the same colors essentially as Odd Nerdrum. So this is what my palette looks like. It's pretty thickly built up. I've been recording a lot of videos. As I mentioned, I have my orange base. So you can see here, this is the orange right here. And then, like I talked about when we were looking at the palette, I have my light side over here. So I bring white into this orange. So if you look, if I just take some of this white and I mix this into the orange, that's the color you're seeing over here. If you just add the white, you're gonna get this sort of nice, warm flesh color. If you add even more white, that's the highlights that I'm using. I pull the orange over here, and that's gonna give me this brown right here. So what I've done is I've actually pre-mixed that brown. I've pre-mixed my basic palette. This flesh color right here, that's pre-mixed, and this brown is pre-mixed. So that way, once I get started painting each day, I don't even have to think about it. I can just put it straight onto the palette. So this brown, if I pull it over here, this is the exact same as if I take orange and I add black to it. So you'll see. So that's the basic idea here, is that I have this orange going through my whole palette. So that's what it looks like. And then if I need to, as I mentioned with those midtones when we were looking at the Rembrandt, what I can do with this brown also, and my other pre-mixed color that I have over here, I have some of this flesh color over here. What I can do is I can take this and I can mix together brown, this flesh color right here, and this is going to give me a nice mid-tone color, something that's kind of in between the two. So this type of color is very useful for the shadow side and anything where I have those transitions between that dark and light. Or if I want to add, let's say those cooler tones to the light side of the face, if I want to get those mid-tones on the light side of the face, this type would be really helpful. So I just want to show really quickly that sort of mixture between the light and the brown. That's going to be really useful for areas like this in the cheek on the shadow side where you're going to have these transitions. Even a lot of these shadows, it's going to be very useful. You can add some white if you need to make it a little bit cooler. And then other areas like here in the beard and some of these transitions even into the hair, or here just on the light side in those midtones. That is the palette. It's the Apelles palette. I take the Apelles palette and I make it even more simple. Okay, what is the best surface to work on? I mean, my preference is always linen with rabbit skin glue, and oil ground on top of that is really the ideal surface, because that's going to create a sort of barrier. So you have a barrier, first of all, with that rabbit skin glue or the glue that you're using, that's going to seal off the linen. So that's your sizing. And then on top of that, if you have the oil ground, it creates a sort of additional barrier. So then your paint is going to stay quite fresh, and as you start to work on it, it's not going to really sink in the same way. So I've found you get more of a fresh look, but you're also not going to deal with as much glare either. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. I'm actually going to launch a supplies company here very, very soon. I've given exclusive access to some of my patrons, so I'm letting them kind of get their fill and buy whatever they need first. But if you look out on my Instagram, I'm gonna have some links, and I'll be, promoting that supply store. So if you just look out, that will be a place to get some really good quality stuff. I think it will be very helpful. So I'm gonna really push now. I'm gonna try and make it, number one, into an ebook, and number two, into a workshop. So if any of you guys are interested in that, look out for that. Okay, so what I will leave you with, I gotta go here in a minute, but what I will leave you all with is thank you for coming, first of all. I really appreciate that you came and you signed up for the newsletter and came to see the demo. And watch out for any of the things I share here in the future. There will be some more opportunities for these sort of free live demos. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and have a great rest of your day.